The security checkpoint at Nexus Station hummed with a quiet efficiency that only came from technology so advanced it bordered on magic. Commander Sarah Chun stood in the scanning chamber, her diplomatic credentials already verified 3 times over by increasingly sophisticated systems. Around her, holographic displays flickered with data streams in dozens of alien languages, processing her biological signature with meticulous care. She had been through similar scans hundreds of times before. As humanity's liaison to the Galactic Council, Sarah was accustomed to the paranoid security measures that governed interstellar politics. The various species that made up the Council had good reason to be cautious. Too many wars had been started by a single assassin with the right modifications or weapons. The Tytherian guard manning the station barely glanced at her, his 6 eyes focused on multiple data streams simultaneously. His crystalline skin reflected the scanner's blue light as he processed her information with the bored efficiency of someone who had done this job for decades. To him, Sarah was just another human diplomat, unremarkable in every way except for the species' annoying tendency to survive things that should have killed them. Standard diplomatic immunity confirmed. The guard droned, his translator converting his harmonic speech into flat English. Medical scans indicate extensive surgical scarring consistent with combat trauma. No prohibited substances or technologies detected. You may proceed to. The scanner stopped mid-sentence. Every light in the chamber shifted from blue to amber, then to a deep, pulsing red that Sarah had never seen before. The Tytherian guard's crystalline features sharpened as data flooded his screens faster than his enhanced neural processors could interpret. "Impossible," he whispered, his voice losing all traces of boredom. Sarah felt a strange tingling sensation across her skin, concentrated along the network of surgical scars that decorated her torso, arms, and legs. The scars were old, souvenirs from the Void War that had nearly consumed humanity 30 years earlier. She had been one of the lucky ones, if you could call surviving what she had survived lucky. The scars were reminders of cybernetic implants that had been removed, of weapons that had been grafted to her bones, of modifications that had made her something more and less than human for the duration of that terrible conflict. "Is there a problem?" Sarah asked, though she could already see that there was. The scanner wasn't just reading her biological signature anymore. It was actively probing her scars with energy signatures she didn't recognize, causing them to emit a faint, silvery glow that was visible even through her diplomatic uniform. The Tytherian guard wasn't looking at her anymore. He was looking through her, his 6 eyes wide with something approaching terror as data cascaded across his screens in patterns that hurt to look at directly. When he spoke, his voice carried harmonics that made Sarah's bones ache. "Security Protocol Omega is now in effect," he announced to no one in particular. "All personnel are to evacuate this section immediately. Contact the Council Directorate and inform them that we have a confirmed activation of precursor emergency protocols." Sarah's training kicked in immediately. Precursor technology was ancient, older than recorded galactic history, older than any of the current species' civilizations. It was also incredibly dangerous, which was why most precursor artifacts were either destroyed or locked away in facilities like Nexus Station. The fact that she had somehow triggered precursor protocols was not just alarming. It was potentially catastrophic. "I need to speak with your supervisor," Sarah said, keeping her voice calm and professional despite the growing certainty that her day was about to become infinitely more complicated. The Tytherian guard looked at her as if she had suggested they take a leisurely stroll through a black hole. "Commander Chun," he said, reading her name from his displays, "you are no longer under standard diplomatic protection. As of this moment, you are classified as a potential existential threat under Galactic Council Resolution 847 Alpha. Please remain stationary while emergency containment protocols are implemented." The chamber around her began to shift, walls extending and thickening as force fields activated with a sound like reality tearing. Sarah found herself standing in what was rapidly becoming a prison cell designed to contain threats that could potentially destroy star systems. The irony wasn't lost on her. She had come to Nexus Station to attend a peace conference, and instead she was being treated like a planet killer. Through the transparent aluminum that now separated her from the rest of the station, Sarah could see evacuation procedures beginning. Personnel of a dozen different species were moving with the kind of urgent efficiency that came from drills practiced for scenarios they hoped would never occur. Emergency lighting bathed everything in harsh white light, and the station's AI began broadcasting evacuation instructions in every known language simultaneously. "This is fascinating," came a new voice, and Sarah turned to see someone approaching her containment cell with curious rather than fearful steps. The newcomer was human, the first other member of her species she had seen since arriving at the station. He was elderly, with silver hair and the kind of deep-set scars around his eyes that spoke of too many years spent staring into the darkness between stars. Dr. Marcus Webb. He introduced himself, apparently unconcerned by the fact that he was approaching what the entire station had just classified as a potential extinction-level threat. Xenoarchaeologist, specialist in precursor technology, and, as of 10 minutes ago, your only hope of getting out of this situation without starting an interstellar incident. Sarah studied him through the containment field. His casual approach to her situation suggested either supreme confidence or complete insanity, and she wasn't sure which would be more useful at the moment. "Dr. Webb, I assume you have some idea what's happening here?" "Oh, I have several ideas," Webb replied, settling into a chair that materialized from the wall at his gesture. "The question is which one is correct, and how much of the truth the Galactic Council is prepared to handle." He gestured at the scars on Sarah's arms, which were still glowing faintly through her uniform. "Tell me, Commander, what do you know about the real history of the Void War?" The question caught Sarah off guard. The Void War was recent history, a brutal conflict between humanity and an extra-dimensional threat that had cost billions of lives before humanity had finally found a way to seal the dimensional rifts and end the invasion. It was well documented, thoroughly studied, and definitely not the kind of ancient mystery that would involve precursor technology. "I know I fought in it," Sarah replied carefully. "I know we barely survived it. And I know that the modifications we had to make to ourselves to fight the void entities were extensive." Webb nodded, his expression growing more serious. "What you probably don't know is that those modifications weren't entirely human innovation. When the void entities first broke through into our dimension, our scientists discovered something interesting in the quantum signatures of the rifts they created. The energy patterns were familiar. They matched fragmentary records found at precursor sites throughout the galaxy." Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the containment field's environmental controls. "You're saying the Void War wasn't the first time someone had fought these entities?" "I'm saying the Void War was a repeat performance," Webb replied grimly. "And the precursors left behind more than just ruins and warnings. They left behind contingency plans." He gestured at her glowing scars again. "When humanity began developing cybernetic modifications to fight the void entities, we thought we were being innovative. What we were actually doing was unconsciously following a template that had been embedded in precursor databases scattered throughout human space. Every modification, every enhancement, every surgical procedure that left those specific scar patterns, it was all part of a larger design." The implications of what Webb was suggesting hit Sarah like a physical blow. The modifications she and thousands of other human soldiers had undergone hadn't been desperate improvisation. They had been the activation of an ancient protocol designed by a civilization that had faced the same threat eons ago. The scars weren't just reminders of war. They were activation keys for technology that predated known civilization. "The scanner didn't just detect my scars," Sarah said slowly. "It recognized them." "Exactly," Webb confirmed. "And now every precursor system in this facility knows that there's a human here who bears the biological markers of someone who survived the integration process. Someone who was modified specifically to fight entities from outside normal space-time." He leaned forward, his expression grave. "Commander, you're not just a war veteran. According to precursor classification systems, You're a living superweapon. As if responding to his words, the containment field around Sarah suddenly shifted frequency, and she felt a new sensation, a subtle vibration that seemed to resonate with her scars at a cellular level. Around the station, she could see additional security measures activating, systems that she was certain hadn't been there moments before. The precursor protocols weren't just identifying her. They were preparing for something. "Dr. Webb," she said quietly, "what exactly do these protocols think I'm here to fight?" Webb's answer was interrupted by a new alarm, one that made the previous evacuation signals seem gentle by comparison. Throughout the station, displays began showing readings that defied easy interpretation, energy signatures that seemed to exist in more dimensions than physics normally allowed. In the depths of space around Nexus Station, sensors designed to detect threats across multiple dimensional frequencies began registering anomalies that shouldn't have been possible. The void entities were coming back, and, according to precursor technology that had waited millennia for activation, Commander Sarachon was exactly where she needed to be. Outside her containment cell, the Tytherian guard who had first scanned her was no longer looking at her with fear. He was looking at her with something approaching hope, his 6 eyes reflecting the growing light from her scars as ancient systems prepared for a war that most of the galaxy had never imagined was possible. The peace conference that had brought her to Nexus Station was about to become irrelevant. What mattered now was whether humanity's survivors were still capable of fighting the kind of war that had nearly destroyed them once before, and whether the Precursor's contingency plans would be enough to prevent the same fate from befalling the entire galaxy. The dimensional readings were getting stronger. Sarah could feel it in her bones, in a network of scars that crisscrossed her body like a map of humanity's darkest hour. Each pulse of exotic energy that the station's sensors detected sent a corresponding resonance through her modified tissue, as if her body was a living antenna tuned to frequencies that shouldn't exist in normal space. Dr. Webb had been joined by a collection of the galaxy's most senior officials, their faces reflecting varying degrees of panic and confusion. The Galactic Council Directorate hadn't convened an emergency session this quickly since the Hegemony Wars, and Sarah could see why. The readings displayed on the holographic projections around her containment cell showed energy signatures that made no sense according to conventional physics. "The quantum distortions are accelerating," announced Counselor Vex, a tall Zephyrian whose normally pristine feathers were ruffled with stress. "Our dimensional monitoring stations are detecting rifts opening in 17 different sectors. The pattern matches historical records from a human's void war, but the scale is significantly larger." Sarah watched the faces of the assembled officials as the implications sank in. Most of the galaxy's species had only heard second-hand accounts of humanity's war against the void entities. To them, it had been a distant conflict involving a relatively young species dealing with some kind of dimensional anomaly. They hadn't understood the true nature of what humanity had faced or what it had taken to survive. "Commander Chun," spoke Chancellor Torvik, the Altarian leader whose people had first established the Galactic Council. His voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to making decisions that affected billions of lives. "Dr. Webb has briefed us on his theories regarding precursor contingency protocols. We need to understand what you remember about your modifications and whether you believe they can be reactivated." Sarah looked down at her arms, where the familiar surgical scars were now glowing with an intensity that made them visible even through her diplomatic uniform. The modifications had been removed decades ago, the cybernetic implants and biological enhancements carefully extracted once the Void War had ended. At least, she had thought they were removed. "The modifications were extensive," she began, choosing her words carefully. "Combat-grade neural interfaces, enhanced reflexes, metabolic optimization for extended operations in hostile environments. But the most significant changes were to our dimensional perception capabilities. We had to be able to see the void entities to fight them effectively, and they existed partially outside normal space-time. The surgical records from the modification process, DR, Webb interjected, calling up holographic displays of medical data that made several council members visibly uncomfortable, show integration patterns that match precursor biotechnology templates. The humans didn't realize it at the time, but they were essentially following an instruction manual that had been embedded in their databases for millennia. Counselor Vex's head crest flattened against her skull, a sign of extreme distress among her people. You're suggesting that humanity was prepared for this conflict? I'm suggesting that the precursors fought this war before, Webb replied grimly. And they lost. But they learned enough to leave behind protocols for any species that might face the same threat in the future. Humanity just happened to be the species that activated those protocols first. Sarah felt another pulse through her scars, stronger this time. Around the station, additional systems were coming online. Defensive networks that hadn't existed when she had arrived, weapons platforms that seemed to be constructing themselves from raw materials stored in the station's outer hull. The precursor protocols weren't just identification systems. They were complete military infrastructure designed to activate in response to specific threats. Commander, Chancellor Torvik addressed her directly, the dimensional rifts are expanding. Our fastest ships are reporting that entire star systems are going dark. If Dr. Webb's theories are correct, and you are indeed a key component in some kind of ancient defense protocol, then we need to understand what that protocol requires. Before Sarah could respond, the station shuddered. It wasn't the kind of vibration that came from mechanical stress or impact. It was deeper than that, as if reality itself was being twisted around them. Through the transparent aluminum of her containment cell, Sarah could see stars disappearing from the view beyond the station's hull, winking out of existence as zones of twisted space-time expanded across local space. They're not just opening rifts, Sarah realized with growing horror. They're spreading them. Each rift destabilizes the local dimensional matrix, making it easier to open additional rifts in nearby areas. It's an exponential expansion pattern. How do you know that? Counselor Vex asked sharply. Sarah paused, surprised by her own certainty. The knowledge had simply been there, as if remembering something she had always known. The modification process included tactical briefings about void entity behavior patterns. We studied their expansion strategies extensively. But even as she said it, she realized that wasn't entirely true. The knowledge felt older than that, deeper, as if it had been integrated into her consciousness at a level below normal memory. Dr. Webb was studying the readings from her scars, which had grown brighter as the dimensional distortions increased. The biological modifications weren't just about enhancing human capabilities, he said slowly. They were about creating a living interface with precursor defense systems. Commander Chun, I believe your scars aren't just activation keys, they're connection points. The precursor protocols are trying to integrate with you directly. The implications of that statement sent a chill through Sarah that had nothing to do with the containment cell's environmental systems. Integration with precursor technology was possible, but it was also incredibly dangerous. The few documented cases of species attempting to interface directly with precursor systems had ended with either complete neural breakdown or transformation into something that was no longer recognizably the original species. If that's true, Chancellor Torvik said grimly, then we're facing a choice between allowing Commander Chun to undergo potentially fatal integration with unknown alien technology or watching the void entities consume the galaxy sector by sector. Sarah looked at the assembled officials, seeing the fear and uncertainty in their faces. These were leaders who commanded fleets that could glass planets and civilizations that spanned multiple star systems, but they were confronting something that operated by rules they didn't understand. The void entities weren't just another hostile alien species. They were a force that existed partially outside the normal universe, making them nearly impossible to fight with conventional weapons. There's a third option, Sarah said quietly. I'm not the only survivor of the modification program. There were thousands of us who underwent the full integration process during the Void War. If the precursor protocols are designed to work with multiple individuals, then we might not need to rely on just one person to interface with their systems. Dr. Webb's eyes widened as he processed the implications. A distributed network. Multiple connection points would be more stable than a single integration, and it would reduce the risk to any individual participant. He began pulling up data on his portable displays. According to the records I've been able to access, there are approximately 3,000 humans still alive who bear the specific scar patterns that indicate full modification integration. Can you contact them? Chancellor Torvik asked urgently. Some of them, Sarah replied. The modification veterans maintain informal communication networks, but gathering them all in one location would take time we don't have. She gestured at the displays, showing the expanding dimensional rifts. However, there might be another way. She closed her eyes and focused on the sensations coming from her scars. The resonance was stronger now, carrying information that her conscious mind couldn't fully process, but that something deeper in her neural architecture could interpret. It was like tuning into a frequency that existed at the edge of perception, a communication channel that operated through quantum entanglement rather than conventional electromagnetic transmission. The scars aren't just interface points, she realized, opening her eyes to find the assembled officials watching her with expressions ranging from hope to terror. They're part of a network. Every person who underwent the modification process is connected through quantum-level biological entanglement. The precursors designed it so that activation of one node would automatically synchronize with all the others. As if responding to her words, the glow from her scars suddenly intensified, and she felt a sensation like doors opening in her mind. Across the galaxy, she could sense other nodes of the network activating. Points of light that corresponded to other modification survivors who were experiencing the same awakening. The sensation was overwhelming at first, like suddenly being able to see in directions that didn't have names, but gradually her enhanced neural architecture adapted to the new input streams. "I can feel them," she whispered. "All of them. They're activating too." Through the network, she could sense the locations of the expanding dimensional rifts, the patterns of void entity movement, and most importantly, the defensive systems that were coming online in response to the precursor protocols. What she saw filled her with both hope and dread. The precursors hadn't just left behind contingency plans. They had left behind weapons. Weapons designed specifically to fight entities that existed partially outside normal reality. Weapons that required living beings with the right modifications to operate them. The galaxy's defense against the void entities wouldn't come from its fleets or its technology. It would come from the 3,000 humans who carried the scars of an ancient war in their flesh. And, according to the protocols now flooding through her consciousness, the real battle was about to begin. The activation cascaded across the galaxy in ways that defied conventional understanding of space and time. Through the quantum entanglement network embedded in her scars, Sarah could perceive her fellow modification survivors awakening to capabilities they had thought were lost forever. Each activation sent ripples through the collective consciousness that was forming, a neural network spanning thousands of light years and operating through principles that the precursors had mastered eons ago. Major Klaus Hendricks was working in his garden on Europa when the integration began. Retired from active service for 25 years, he had spent decades trying to forget the things he had seen during the Void War. The scars across his back began to glow as he knelt among his tomatoes, and suddenly he could see dimensional rifts opening near Proxima Centauri with perfect clarity despite being in an entirely different star system. Dr. Yuki Tanaka was teaching xenobiology at the University of New Geneva when her neural interface came back online. The surgical scars around her temples pulsed with silver light as her consciousness expanded to encompass tactical data about void entity behavior patterns she had never learned. Students fled her lecture hall as holographic displays began materializing around her without any visible technology to project them. Captain Maria Santos was piloting a cargo freighter through the Vega system when her body's metabolic optimization protocols reactivated. The network of scars across her arms and torso began drawing ambient energy from the ship's power systems, enhancing her reflexes and perception to superhuman levels as she found herself automatically plotting intercept courses for void entities that hadn't even emerged from their dimensional rifts yet. Through the network, Sarah could feel each activation, each moment of confusion and recognition as her fellow veterans realized what was happening. But she could also feel something else, a presence that was vast and ancient and utterly inhuman, pressing against the edges of their collective consciousness like a tide of living darkness. The void entities weren't just random extra-dimensional predators. They were intelligent, organized, and they remembered humanity from the First War. Worse, they had spent the intervening decades studying the dimensional barriers that had contained them, learning to breach them more effectively. This invasion wouldn't be the chaotic, desperate struggle that the Void War had been. It would be a systematic conquest carried out by enemies who had learned from their previous defeat. Commander Chen. Chancellor Torvik's voice seemed to come from very far away, even though he was standing directly outside her containment cell. Your biological readings have changed dramatically. Are you still yourself? Sarah opened eyes she didn't remember closing, realizing that her perception had shifted to encompass multiple dimensional layers simultaneously. She could see Chancellor Torvik as he appeared in normal space, but she could also see the quantum probability matrices surrounding him, the potential futures branching out from each decision he might make. It was disorienting, but not unfamiliar. She had experienced similar expanded awareness during the worst battles of the Void War. "I'm still me," she replied, though she wasn't entirely certain that was true. The Sarah-chan who had arrived at Nexus Station for a routine diplomatic assignment felt like someone she remembered rather than someone she was. "But I'm also part of something larger now. The network is fully active, and the precursor defense protocols are coming online." Dr. Webb was frantically recording everything, his instruments struggling to measure energy patterns that operated according to principles his equipment wasn't designed to recognize. "The power output from your scars has increased by several orders of magnitude," he reported to the assembled officials. "But more importantly, we're detecting dimensional manipulation effects that suggest active interference with the void entity incursion attempts." As if to confirm his words, several of the holographic displays around the chamber shifted to show dimensional monitoring data from across the galaxy. The expanding rifts that had been growing exponentially just minutes before were now encountering resistance. In some cases, the rifts were being forcibly collapsed by energy patterns that seemed to originate from empty space. In others, void entities that had begun emerging from dimensional tiers were being engaged by weapons fire that appeared without any visible source. The network isn't just for coordination, Sarah realized, her voice carrying harmonics that made several of the officials step back nervously. "We're controlling the precursor defensive systems directly. Every modified human is a command node for weapons platforms that have been dormant for millions of years." Through the quantum entanglement network, she could feel Major Hendricks on Europa directing orbital defense satellites that had materialized around Earth's solar system. Dr. Tanaka was coordinating deep space monitoring stations that were appearing throughout the core worlds. Captain Santos was somehow piloting weapons platforms that existed partially outside normal space-time, engaging void entities in dimensional combat that occurred across multiple reality layers simultaneously. But the most disturbing realization was yet to come. As the network stabilized and the collective consciousness of the modification survivors began to integrate, Sarah became aware of additional data streams flowing through their shared neural architecture. Information that wasn't coming from the precursor systems, but from the void entities themselves. The enemy was already here, not just emerging through dimensional rifts, but embedded within normal space in ways that made them nearly impossible to detect without the enhanced perception capabilities that the modifications provided. Some had been here for decades, slowly influencing galactic politics and technological development to create conditions favorable for a full-scale invasion. "Chancellor Torvik," Sarah said urgently, "you need to initiate complete communication isolation for this facility. No signals in or out. No data transfers, no personnel movements." The void entities have infiltration assets throughout the galaxy, and they're monitoring our communications. The Chancellor's expression shifted to alarm. Infiltration assets? Are you saying they've compromised Council security? Before Sarah could answer, the station's main computer systems began showing anomalous activity. Data was being accessed and transmitted at rates that exceeded the station's bandwidth capabilities, suggesting that something was interfacing with their systems through methods that bypassed normal communication protocols. Worse, the access patterns indicated that sensitive information about the precursor defense networks was being extracted and transmitted to unknown destinations. They're learning our capabilities in real time, Sarah realized with growing horror. Every defensive system we activate, every tactical decision we make, they're monitoring it all and adapting their strategies accordingly. Dr. Webb's instruments detected the intrusion before the station's conventional security systems even registered that something was wrong. The infiltration isn't technological, he announced grimly. We're dealing with direct dimensional manipulation. Something is accessing our systems from outside normal space-time. That was when Sarah saw it. A flicker of movement in the space between realities, visible only through her enhanced perception. The infiltration asset wasn't a conventional spy or even an advanced AI. It was a void entity that had learned to exist partially within normal space, occupying the quantum probability matrices that surrounded all matter and energy in the universe. It could observe and influence events without being detected by conventional sensors, making it the perfect surveillance system for an invasion force that operated according to principles that most species couldn't even comprehend. Everyone needs to leave this area immediately, Sarah commanded, her voice carrying harmonics that triggered instinctive flight responses in several of the assembled officials. The entity is preparing to manifest physically, and when it does, it will try to eliminate the network nodes before we can establish full coordination with the precursor defenses. Chancellor Torvik hesitated. Commander, if we evacuate, you'll be facing this threat alone. Sarah felt the network responding to the growing danger, tactical data flowing through the collective consciousness as thousands of modification survivors across the galaxy prepared for coordinated action. She could sense weapons platforms powering up in dimensions adjacent to normal space, defensive systems that had been designed by a civilization that had faced this exact threat before. But she could also sense the vast intelligence behind the void entity strategy, an alien consciousness that had spent decades preparing for this moment. I won't be alone, she replied, her scars now blazing with light that hurt to look at directly. And neither will any of us. The precursors designed this system to ensure that no single node would have to face the enemy without support. As the officials evacuated the chamber, Sarah felt the network reaching critical activation levels. Across the galaxy, her fellow survivors were engaging void entities in combat that spanned multiple dimensions simultaneously. The real war was beginning, and this time, humanity wouldn't be fighting alone. They would be fighting with weapons and tactics developed by the only civilization in galactic history that had successfully resisted a void entity invasion. The question was whether it would be enough. The enemy had learned from their previous defeat as well, and they had spent the intervening time developing new strategies and capabilities. The battle for the galaxy's survival was about to be fought on a scale that would make the original Void War seem like a minor skirmish. And in the depths of space around Nexus Station, reality began to tear as something vast and hungry forced its way through the barriers between dimensions. The manifestation began as a wrongness in the air itself, a distortion that made reality seem thin and fragile around the edges. Sarah could perceive it through multiple dimensional layers simultaneously, a vast intelligence pushing through the barriers between realities with the patience of something that had existed for eons and the hunger of something that consumed entire civilizations for sustenance. Through the network, she felt her fellow survivors responding to the threat. Major Hendricks on Europa was directing energy patterns that reshaped local space-time, creating dimensional barriers that would slow the entity's manifestation. Dr. Tanaka had somehow accessed precursor manufacturing protocols and was constructing weapons that existed in 17 dimensions simultaneously. Captain Santos was engaging advanced elements of the void entity forces in battles that occurred across multiple timeline branches at once. But the entity manifesting near Nexus Station wasn't a scout or advance guard. Through the collective consciousness of the network, Sarah could sense its true nature, a void hegemon, one of the supreme intelligences that commanded entire invasion fleets and possessed the capability to devour star systems by converting their mass energy into exotic matter that could exist outside normal physics. During the original Void War, humanity had never encountered anything like it directly. They had only fought the lesser entities, the scouts, and soldiers of a vast hierarchy that extended into dimensions human science couldn't even theorize about. The containment cell around Sarah began to fluctuate as local space-time became unstable. The transparent aluminum walls showed stress patterns that defied material science. The metal was experiencing forces that pulled it in directions that didn't exist in normal three-dimensional space. Emergency systems throughout Nexus Station were triggering responses to conditions that their designers had never imagined possible. Warning: dimensional cohesion falling below minimum safe parameters. The station's AI announced in multiple languages simultaneously, initiating emergency evacuation of all personnel. Estimated time until structural integrity failure, 17 minutes. Sarah felt the network calculating responses to the threat faster than any conventional computer system could process. The precursor defensive protocols weren't just about weapons and tactics. They included complete strategic doctrines for fighting an enemy that could reshape reality at will. What she learned through those protocols filled her with both hope and terror. The precursors had fought multiple wars against the void entities, spanning millions of years and countless star systems. They had won most of those conflicts, but at costs that had eventually led to their extinction as a recognizable civilization. Each victory had required them to become more like their enemies, incorporating techniques and technologies that transformed them into something that could match the void entity's capabilities. By the end, the precursors had become so alien that they could no longer exist in the same reality as the species they had been trying to protect. The defensive systems Sarah was now interfacing with represented their final strategy, a way to fight the void entities without losing themselves in the process. Instead of transforming into something inhuman, they had created protocols that would allow other species to temporarily access the necessary capabilities while remaining fundamentally unchanged. The modification survivors weren't becoming precursors. They were becoming the living components of weapons systems designed by the precursor's final iteration. Through the quantum entanglement network, Sarah could feel the full scope of what they were facing. The current invasion wasn't just another attempt by the void entities to expand into normal space. It was a coordinated effort by multiple hegemon-class intelligences to establish permanent bridgehead positions throughout the galaxy. Once those positions were secured, they would begin the systematic conversion of all matter and energy in local space into forms that could exist in the spaces between realities. The entity manifesting near Nexus Station solidified into something that hurt to perceive directly. It existed in too many dimensions at once, its form shifting between configurations that suggested vast tentacles, geometric patterns that folded space around themselves, and abstract mathematical concepts given physical existence. When it spoke, its voice carried harmonics that made the station's hull resonate like a struck bell. Interesting, the Void Hegemon said, its words arriving through direct manipulation of local reality rather than conventional sound waves. The survivors of the first integration attempt. We had assumed the modification process was irreversible after cellular death. Yet here you are, reactivated after decades of dormancy. Sarah felt the network responding to the entity's presence, tactical protocols flooding through the collective consciousness as thousands of modification survivors across the galaxy prepared for coordinated action. But she could also sense something unexpected, curiosity. The void hegemon wasn't immediately attacking. It was studying them, analyzing their capabilities with the patience of something that viewed time as a flexible resource. You want to understand how the precursors designed the integration process, Sarah realized, her enhanced perception allowing her to interpret the entity's behavioral patterns. You've been trying to replicate their biotechnological achievements for millions of years. The void hegemon's form shifted into something resembling approval, though the emotion was so alien that it barely registered as recognizable. The extinct ones achieved something remarkable. Weapons that could threaten us while remaining biologically compatible with species that exist primarily in normal space-time. We have studied their ruins for eons without comprehending the underlying principles. Through the network, Sarah felt her fellow survivors sharing tactical data at speeds that exceeded the limitations of conventional communication. Major Hendricks had identified weaknesses in the hegemon's dimensional anchor points. Dr. Tanaka had accessed precursor manufacturing protocols that could produce weapons capable of severing an entity's connection to multiple reality layers simultaneously. Captain Santos had engaged similar enemies before and survived, her experience providing tactical frameworks that the entire network could utilize. But Sarah also realized something that filled her with strategic dread. The void hegemon wasn't just here to study them. It was here to capture them. The entity's invasion strategy included provisions for acquiring intact modification survivors and learning to replicate their capabilities. If the void entities could produce their own versions of the precursor biotechnology, they would become exponentially more dangerous to any species that tried to resist them. The integration process isn't something you can replicate, Sarah told the entity, hoping to buy time while the network coordinated its response. It requires biological compatibility factors that only developed during specific evolutionary circumstances. The void hegemon's form rippled with what might have been amusement. Perhaps, but we are patient and we have considerable resources to devote to the problem. The real question is whether you will cooperate with our research efforts or whether we will need to conduct our studies on less cooperative subjects. That was when Sarah felt the network reach full coordination levels. Across the galaxy, modification survivors were interfacing with precursor weapons platforms that operated according to principles that made conventional physics seem quaint. But, more importantly, they were working together in ways that transcended normal human communication, their enhanced neural architectures allowing for coordination that approached the efficiency of a single distributed intelligence. The attack came from 17 directions simultaneously, energy patterns that existed in dimensions the void hegemon couldn't fully perceive. Precursor weapons materialized around Nexus Station like flowers of crystallized mathematics, their firing patterns creating interference zones in local spacetime that disrupted the entity's ability to maintain dimensional coherence. The void hegemon's response was immediate and devastating. Reality twisted around it as it fought back, unleashing forces that made nearby space fold in on itself like origami constructed from the fundamental forces of the universe. But the precursor defensive protocols had been designed for exactly this kind of conflict, and the weapons platforms adapted to each attack faster than the entity could modify its tactics. Through the network, Sarah could feel the tide of battle across the galaxy. This wasn't just a localized engagement. It was a coordinated campaign involving thousands of simultaneous conflicts as modification survivors engaged void entities throughout known space. Some battles were being won, others lost, but the overall pattern was clear. Humanity's veterans were fighting with capabilities that matched their enemies' strengths while remaining recognizably human. The void hegemon near Nexus Station began to destabilize as the precursor weapons found optimal targeting solutions. But as it retreated toward the dimensional rift it had used to enter normal space, it broadcast a message that chilled Sarah to her enhanced bones. Impressive, the entity acknowledged as its form began to fade back into the spaces between realities. But you have revealed your capabilities prematurely. We will adapt our strategies accordingly. and when we return, we will be prepared for what you can bring against us." As the entity disappeared and the dimensional distortions around Nexus Station began to stabilize, Sarah felt a grim certainty settling over the network. They had won this engagement, but they had also shown their hand to an enemy that was capable of learning and adapting faster than any conventional opponent. The next wave of attacks would be designed specifically to counter the precursor defensive systems. The war for the galaxy's survival was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. 3 standard galactic days passed before the void entities returned, and when they came back, they brought with them adaptations that sent chills through the quantum entanglement network connecting humanity's modification survivors. Through her expanded consciousness, Sarah could perceive the new invasion strategies as they unfolded across 17 different dimensional layers simultaneously. The void entities had learned. They had studied the recordings of their previous engagements with the precursor defensive systems, analyzed the energy signatures and tactical patterns, and developed countermeasures that were terrifyingly effective. Instead of manifesting as individual entities that could be targeted by conventional weapons, they were emerging as distributed swarms that existed partially in normal space and partially in dimensions that the precursor systems couldn't directly access. Worse, they had found ways to disrupt the quantum entanglement network itself. Major Hendricks on Europa reported increasing interference with his connection to the collective consciousness. Dr. Tanaka's access to precursor manufacturing protocols was becoming sporadic. Captain Santos found herself fighting battles where her tactical coordination with other network nodes was delayed or corrupted, forcing her to rely on individual capabilities that were insufficient against the evolved enemy tactics. Sarah felt the strain through her own connection to the network. The void entities were using some kind of dimensional interference pattern that attacked the quantum-level biological modifications that made the network possible. It was a sophisticated assault on the fundamental principles that the precursors had used to create their biotechnological weapons, and it was working. "Commander Chun." Dr. Webb's voice carried an edge of desperation as he studied the readings from her deteriorating connection to the precursor systems. The interference patterns suggest that the void entities have developed specific countermeasures against your modification signatures. They're targeting the quantum entanglement matrices that allow network coordination. Through the fragmenting network, Sarah could sense her fellow survivors struggling with the same problems. Their enhanced capabilities were being systematically degraded by an enemy that had learned to target the specific biological modifications that made them effective. Without full network coordination, the precursor defensive systems were operating at reduced efficiency, allowing void entities to establish bridgehead positions throughout the galaxy. But there is something else, something that Sarah could perceive through her degraded but still functional connection to the collective consciousness. Hidden within the precursor protocols were additional layers of programming that hadn't activated during the previous engagements. Contingency systems designed for scenarios where the primary defensive networks were compromised or corrupted. The realization came with a mixture of hope and horror. The precursors hadn't just created one defensive system. They had created multiple systems, each designed to activate when the previous layer proved insufficient. But each successive layer required greater integration with alien technology, greater transformation of the biological systems that made the network possible. Dr. Webb, Sarah said urgently, access the deepest levels of the precursor databases. Look for protocols labeled as final integration scenarios. I think there's another layer to these defensive systems. Webb's fingers flew over his instruments, diving deeper into data structures that seemed to exist in more dimensions than his equipment could properly map. What he found made his face go pale with understanding and fear. "Commander, these protocols, they require complete biological integration with precursor technology. The modification survivors would need to undergo transformation that would make them more precursor than human. The process appears to be irreversible." Sarah felt the weight of the decision settling over the network like a funeral shroud. Through their fragmenting connection, she could sense her fellow survivors considering the same terrible choice. They could maintain their humanity and watch the galaxy fall to the void entities, or they could sacrifice what they were to become something capable of winning the war. The decision wasn't just individual, it was collective. The quantum entanglement network meant that any modification survivor who chose to undergo final integration would affect the entire system. They would either all transform together, or none of them could transform at all. Major Hendricks was the first to speak through the degrading network connection. I've seen what the void entities do to the worlds they conquer. I've seen entire star systems converted into something that exists outside normal physics. Their populations transformed into components of alien intelligence networks. If the choice is between becoming something inhuman ourselves or watching that happen to everyone we care about, Dr. Tanaka's voice carried the weight of scientific understanding. The transformation protocols suggest that we would retain core elements of human consciousness and memory. We wouldn't cease to exist. We would become something more than what we are now, something capable of protecting the species we came from. Captain Santos added her perspective with characteristic military pragmatism. The war isn't going to end until either we develop capabilities that can match their adaptations, or they succeed in converting the galaxy into whatever form of existence they prefer. We can evolve to meet the threat, or we can fail to evolve and become extinct. Through the network, Sarah could feel the consensus building. One by one, the modification survivors were accepting the necessity of final integration, understanding that their humanity was a price they could pay for the survival of humanity itself. It was a choice that would have been impossible for individuals to make alone, but the collective consciousness allowed them to share the burden and the responsibility. Initiating final integration protocols, Sarah announced to the assembled Galactic Council officials who had returned to observe the proceedings. All modification survivors are consenting to irreversible biological transformation for the purpose of accessing terminal-level precursor defensive capabilities. Chancellor Torvik watched in fascination and horror as Sarah's scars began to glow with intensity that made the previous manifestations seem dim by comparison. Around her, reality itself began to shift as the containment cell was transformed by energies that operated according to principles that predated known science by millions of years. The transformation was unlike anything the galaxy had witnessed in recorded history. Sarah could feel her consciousness expanding to encompass multiple dimensional layers simultaneously, her enhanced neural architecture adapting to process information streams that would have burned out unmodified biological systems. But she could also feel her fellow survivors undergoing the same changes, their collective consciousness evolving into something that retained human values and motivations while transcending human limitations. Through their transformed perception, they could see the true scope of the void entity's invasion strategy. The current assault was just one phase of a multi-dimensional campaign that spanned time as well as space, with void intelligences manipulating causality patterns to ensure their victory across multiple timeline branches. The entities weren't just trying to conquer the galaxy. They were trying to restructure reality itself to make resistance impossible. But the final integration protocols gave the transformed humans capabilities that could match such strategies. They could perceive and manipulate the same dimensional forces that the void entities used, fight battles across multiple timeline branches simultaneously, and coordinate responses that operated faster than the speed of causality itself. The counterattack began immediately and on a scale that made the previous engagements seem insignificant. Transformed humans across the galaxy engaged void entities in conflicts that spanned 17 dimensions and multiple timeline branches, using weapons that existed as living mathematics and tactics that rewrote the laws of physics in local areas. They fought not just for territory or resources, but for the right to determine what form of existence would be permitted in normal space-time. The war raged for subjective years, while lasting only minutes in normal time, each transformed human simultaneously fighting thousands of battles across multiple reality layers. But gradually, inevitably, their combined efforts began to turn the tide. Void entity bridgehead positions were systematically eliminated. Dimensional rifts were sealed using techniques that made them impossible to reopen, and the invading intelligences found themselves facing opponents who could match their capabilities while retaining the unpredictable creativity that made humans dangerous. When the final void hegemon retreated through a dimensional rift that the transformed humans immediately sealed behind it, Sarah found herself standing in the same containment chamber where her transformation had begun, but she was no longer entirely human. She was something more, a living fusion of human consciousness and precursor technology capable of perceiving and manipulating reality at levels that transcended normal biological limitations. Commander Chun. Chancellor Torvik spoke carefully, uncertain whether the being before him still retained enough humanity to respond to familiar forms of communication. Are you still? Sarah smiled, and for a moment the expression was purely human despite the dimensional energies that danced around her transformed features. We're still us, Chancellor. We're just us with better tools. The galaxy is safe, the void entities have been repelled, and humanity has evolved into something that can stand guard against threats that conventional civilizations can't even perceive. She gestured toward the stars visible through the station's viewports, stars that now remain stable in normal space-time instead of winking out as dimensional rifts consumed them. The precursors left their legacy not just in their technology, but in their understanding that sometimes the greatest gift you can give to the universe is the willingness to become something more than what you started as. Through the transformed network, Sarah could sense her fellow evolved humans taking their positions as guardians throughout the galaxy, no longer entirely part of the species they had come from, but forever dedicated to protecting those they had left behind. They would watch over the development of galactic civilization, ready to respond to threats that operated beyond normal comprehension while remaining connected to the human values that had motivated their transformation. The scars were gone now, replaced by patterns of living light that existed in dimensions beyond normal perception. But the memories they had carried were preserved, transformed into something greater, reminders not of pain and loss, but of the prices that must sometimes be paid to ensure that life, consciousness, and the possibility of growth could continue to exist in a universe that contained forces dedicated to their extinction. Humanity had survived by learning to become something more than human, and in doing so, they had ensured that being human would remain a choice available to future generations.